Welcome to the Fantasy Throwdown Podcast, bringing you the latest in sports news, fantasy analysis, and opinions. Don't forget the hot takes. Can't have a sports show without hot takes these days. What about hot cakes, though? I want some hot cakes. Now here's your host, ready to jump into the thick of things, Dwayne Callender.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. We are continuing on with our review of the NCAA bracket. We're going to get into the Midwest region, which, I'll be honest, this is a couple of heavy hitters in here and teams that I don't really think are going to be much of an impact, but I'll get into my reasons why. So without much further ado, let's talk about the third ranked number one seed in North Carolina. The Tar Heels, I think, from a profile standpoint, are the best team to match up against Duke. It's just in terms of offensive and defensive efficiency, the Tar Heels are in the top 7 in both offense and defense. From a tempo standpoint, they're in the top 50. You know, it's just one of those teams that I think from a balance standpoint, they have so many things going for them. They're one of the few teams that Duke can't just be able to push around at all. So, you know, it's the closest comparable that Duke has in terms of talent level and just being able to play coordinated basketball. Obviously, Carolina doesn't have the NBA top-level talent as they would with guys like Luke May, but they have so much experience with Cam Johnson that they have enough of wherewithal to be able to sustain those runs that Duke tends to go on. Because the issue with Duke is you're going to get blitzed at different points of the game. It's more along the lines of, can you avoid the turnovers and, not get too caught up in the moment. That's the one thing Carolina can do. They can get easier buckets that most teams can't do. And, again, because Carolina can push tempo as well, you know, they don't necessarily have the issues that other teams do when they go up against Duke, and that, you know, when tempo gets pushed up, they kind of fall apart. That's the reason why, you know, I don't necessarily see a team like Kentucky being able to match up against Duke. Kentucky being the number 2 seed in the region. But we'll get into that in a bit. But, you know, like just kind of going through the bracket itself, Carolina's got Iona in the first round. Don't see much of anything happening there. The 8-9 matchup in the Midwest, you've got Utah State and Washington. Washington, you know, I mean, the Pac-12 was an overall dumpster fire this year in terms of competition, between Arizona basically being on a death penalty sentence because of Sean Miller's actions, also in the federal wiretap investigation that's been going on. But, you know, just a ton of teams in disarray for the Pac-12. I mean, Steve Alford getting fired early on in the year with UCLA. Like, there were just a number of things going on with Pac-12 teams that, you know, made it a league where the fact that they got 3 teams in the tournament, you know, I just look at it as like, you know, Oregon winning and getting the automatic bid. That's what screwed this up overall, but, you know, it is what it is. But Washington was technically the best team in the Pac-12 throughout the year. You know, they, you know, it's a team that, you know, they shoot 3-pointers and that's about it. I can't really say anything that nice about the team because Washington played throughout the year. It was a weak conference, and from a metric standpoint, nothing about Washington really jumps out at you. There's a reason why after dropping the Pac-12 title game, they got knocked down to a 9 seed. It's just a team that doesn't really have a whole lot going for it. They got 3 seniors on the roster. At least that gives them a little bit of experience. But as an overall team, top to bottom, they just did not impress at all during the year. It's as simple as that. Utah State, on the other hand, a solid year throughout in terms of doing well in the Mountain West. In terms of what the Utah State Aggies do well, defensive rebounding was pretty much their calling card. They did have a win over Nevada State. They did have a win over Nevada earlier this year, which ended up getting mired in controversy because you had almost a physical altercation between the Nevada team and the Utah State fans that had stormed the court, but that's neither here nor there. Utah State should be able to get a win against Washington. I think that pretty much is where it goes there. I don't see them being able to offer anything that would give North Carolina any trouble. The thing about North Carolina last year was they just ran into a buzzsaw of a Mississippi State team that had NBA talent on that roster. That Mississippi State team last year just underachieved, and then all of a sudden, once the lights were on and guys were thinking about NBA prospects, then they decided to turn it on. One of the more bizarre things that you'll see in the second round matchup. Carolina getting absolutely dumped on last year, I think gives them even more reason to be laser focused for the tournament this year. So I just don't see anything happening in the early rounds to Carolina. So moving on, you got Auburn, who's overseeded as a 5 seed, playing New Mexico State. New Mexico State dominated the WAC this year. They had a great year. Not a strong non-conference schedule, which is why, despite having a great year in the WAC, you see New Mexico State as a 12 seed because in terms of non-conference schedule, they were pretty much in the bottom 30% in all of NCAA competition. Don't really have any signature wins. They dominated their conference. Don't play great defense based off of the metrics because they only ranked about in the mid 80s in terms of overall team defense. Adjusted, they play at a slower pace. So I'm not a big fan of New Mexico State. The one thing that I have concerns about, though, is that for Auburn, they're a Bruce Pearl coach team. And the one thing I always say about Bruce Pearl coach teams is that they're like the guy at the craps table when they're on a hot streak and everyone's crowding around them and they're about to lose and roll snake eyes. It happens pretty much every single time Bruce Pearl's in the NCAA competition. Everyone's always talking up on how his team's in great form. They're poised to make a deep run. You know what? Usually that's when the lights are about to go out. So maybe Auburn gets the win here in the first round, and I don't really see much else coming else after that point. Auburn, from a metric standpoint, they play good defense, and they have one of the more efficient offenses in the league. There's nothing wrong from a metric standpoint. There's nothing wrong with saying that Auburn can do well in the NCAA tournament because, they turn the ball. They force teams to turn the ball over at an incredibly high rate. I believe they're in the top 5 in that in terms of the KenPom rankings. But the biggest knock I have on them, besides the fact that they have a really bad tendency to get into cold stretches shooting the ball. I just don't have any confidence in Bruce Pearl. There have been more than a few early first-round exits that have compiled in his career. That's the reason why he's a sub-500 coach in the NCAA tournament with over 20 appearances in the tournament. It's just, I just don't really see a whole lot coming out of this Auburn group. I think, and when it does go out, it always looks ugly for Bruce Pearl teams in the NCAA tournament. So I just think that they get an initial win here against New Mexico State, but if they got knocked off in a 5-12 upset, it would not surprise me in the slightest. I've seen this story too many times to be perfectly honest. Moving on to another team that flops quite often in the NCAA tournament, we got Bill Self and his Kansas Jayhawks versus Northeastern. Here's the problem with Kansas. They didn't win the Big 12 this year because of injuries. You've got Udoka Azubuike, who's done for the year with a wrist injury, and LeGerald Vick took a leave of absence, even though he was the second in scoring on the team. It's just not the same team that it was in the beginning of the year. I don't really have a great feel for Kansas. The only reason why I could say that Auburn can make it to the Sweet 16 is because I don't know what Kansas team is going to show up. So if you told me that a weaker Northeastern team pulled off an upset, I would be surprised because Northeastern runs one of those gimmick offenses where they don't play any big people. They'll play 4 small guards and just try to do Nelly ball. For those of you who don't know what Nelly ball is, that is Coach Don Nelson's approach to former NBA coach Don Nelson and his approach to playing basketball, where you play a bunch of undersized guards, you play one mostly undersized center as well. You try to out athletic your own opponent. So in terms of agility and speed, you try to beat them out to the rebounds, and you're jacking up a ton of shots. They basically shoot 40% from the field. And in that lineup, they got at least 5 guys that average double-digit points. So it's a spread-out team in terms of efficiency. It's just one where I would say Northeastern, they're not going to be playing much defense that's going to concern you because, again, with an undersized lineup, there are going to be matchup problems all across the court that Kansas should be able to take advantage of if they're managing the ball correctly and they're not turning it over. I just look at it as it's a different Kansas team than we've seen, so it's a lot of leaning on a couple of freshmen. So it's not great. This isn't like your typical Kansas team, but usually I will say this about Bill Self teams. It's when you expect Kansas to get knocked out of the tournament early, that's when Kansas makes their deep runs in the NCAA tournament. So there's that positive spin on it, is that the Kansas is going to have no positive buzz going into this tournament whatsoever. So they're playing with house money, given all the injuries that have occurred to the team. But I can't really call an upset here because from watching Northeastern play the 1 or 2 times I had a chance to, Usually they be on like a CBS Sports network kind of game. I can't say I was impressed, but it's a different look than what Kansas is going to be used to. I just think that Kansas, if they stay patient and run the offense, they'll be able to pull away and win by double digits. And to be honest, getting a matchup against Auburn isn't the worst thing in the world because people are going to pick Auburn in that matchup, and I think Kansas could win that matchup straight up. So there's that for food for thought. Iowa State as the 6th seed versus Ohio State as the 11th seed. Ohio State was one of those teams that was fortunate enough to get into the NCAA tournament. They play solid defense, but man, the Buckeyes really struggle from the offensive end. They're not a great perimeter shooting team. Most of the commentary that I say about Auburn applies that even stronger to Auburn in that they're not great from an offensive efficiency standpoint. They're not as good as defensively, and from a tempo standpoint, they're in the bottom. They're in the bottom third. There's nothing really all that lovely to say about Ohio State other than it's an accomplishment that they avoided being in the playing game. But outside of that, this is one of those teams that you could have taken out of the tournament and no one would have actually missed them at all. With that being said, Iowa State, wasn't all that impressive in the Big 12 regular season. They did put it together to become the low-seeded team ever to win the Big 12 conference tournament. They are in the top 10 in offensive efficiency, and one of the reasons being is that they get a lot of easy baskets from an efficiency standpoint. As I said, they're in the top 10, but from an overall field goal shooting perspective, they shoot 55% from the field, and they're not really a three-point shooting team. They kind of work the ball into the middle of the paint. They get easier buckets. It's just not a great defensive team, but against an Ohio State team that, doesn't really do much to threaten you, I think Iowa State should be in a good spot to move on here. I don't really see any kind of upset potential. I just don't think Iowa State does anything that really move the needle one way or another, though. Moving on to Houston versus Georgia State. The Cougars in the American Athletic Conference, they have a roster of players that should be able to do well in the NCAA tournament. Houston, as you may recall, had a great matchup against Michigan in the round of 32 last year. Michigan managed to knock off Houston and then make it all the way to the Final Four. A lot of Cougars fans thought that was their year to make a run, and then they had a great year again this year with a 31-3 record. I know a bunch of Houston fans were ticked off that they didn't get a higher seed, given the conference that they're in and the record that they had. They have a good team. I'm just I would say one of the biggest knocks I have against Houston is the fact that they're a really small roster. Right? They don't have any starter over 6'8". I think that puts them at a disadvantage against some of the teams that they're going to be coming up against. So I think they could be vulnerable to getting knocked out by an Iowa State that has a little bit of length and size in the second round. I don't think Georgia State's going to give Houston any trouble here. In terms of looking at what Georgia State brings to the table, they're also a really small team because they don't have any starters that are over 6'6". So the one knock against Houston doubly applies to Georgia State. I just think that it's one of those teams that plays above the rim. Problem is that they're playing a better version of themselves in Houston. So I think that one, is more of a matter-of-fact victory for Houston than some of these other matchups. So stranger things have happened. I just wouldn't count on an upset happening there. Moving on to Wofford Seton Hall. This is one of the toughest games to pick in the first-round matchups because I love Wofford, but I also love Seton Hall. Wofford basically just dominated the Southern Conference this year. Undefeated in conference play, won their tournament in impressive fashion. They were going to get an at-large bid even without winning their conference tournament. But, they won their conference tournament style and just handled their business. If you're looking for what Wofford actually does well, it's just a great balanced offense with a number of seniors that get double-digit points. They shoot. They have a couple of shooters well over 40% from an efficiency standpoint. They were fourth in field goal percentage. They had the second highest three-point percentage shooting as a team. Their star player Fletcher McGee led the nation with made 3-pointers on 43% shooting. They've got a great story here from an efficiency standpoint. If they're in a different bracket region, I would say that they would have a better shot. I mean, if Wofford was in the South region, I would be picking them to make a Loyola Chicago type of run because they have that kind of credibility with me just from seeing them play. With that being said, being in the bottom half of the draw of the Midwest region, not a fun place to be because they're going up against a Seton Hall squad that has a lot of experience. They play solid enough defense to give teams trouble. They're not going to get hurt from an offensive standpoint. The Pirates do very well against 3-point shooting teams because they got to deal with Villanova and Marquette. They are very used to playing in these types of games. So nothing Wofford does is really going to surprise Seton Hall, which is why the Pirates are a very dangerous squad for Wofford to match up against. Just from a standpoint of, the Seton Hall runs a really thin bench. The Pirates really rank in the bottom third. Like I would say, out of all the NCAA teams, Seton Hall, the only team that plays fewer bench minutes than Seton Hall would be Nevada. So if Wofford can get Seton Hall into a little bit of a faster pace, Wofford should be able to pull away from Seton Hall. But I think that's going to be one of the tighter matchups in the earlier rounds because, I really like Wofford, to be honest. But it wouldn't shock me at all if Seton Hall pulled off an upset because realistically, I think that game's basically a pick'em. But if Wofford had, because I'll probably throw in a bracket or two in some of the larger pools where Wofford makes a run because I think Wofford does have the credentials to be able to knock out a Kentucky in the second round. Seton Hall also has that capabilities as well. But I just think from an efficiency standpoint, what Kentucky sometimes struggles with on the offensive end at times, that leads to an opportunity for a team like Wofford with their 3-point shooting ability to pull off an upset in the round of 32. So, speaking of the Kentucky Wildcats, overall number 2 seed in the region, and I look at Kentucky as a team that can make a Final Four run without much difficulty. I just think that the biggest knock on Kentucky, as usual each year, is the lack of experience and what happens if they get into a tight matchup early on in the tournament against a difficult team. So that's why I look at it as a case where Wofford could knock off Kentucky early. But if Kentucky can get past that first weekend, get the jitters out of the way with Coach Calipari, they are in the top 15 in both offense and defense. They play at a slower tempo than we've seen out of Coach Cal's teams in the past. They're ranked 265th in the country in terms of tempo, which is pretty astonishing because usually you'd think of Coach Cal's teams being able to push the pace a bit more. He's had this group kind of develop a little bit further, but I would say that this is not his most talented team at all. But Calipari has done a pretty good job with the roster. The best player for Kentucky is Reed Travis, who's a graduate transfer as a 6'8" forward. But the rest of the team, I would say, he's got horses that could actually make a run here. So again, I could see Kentucky making a deep run here. The one caveat would be, as always with Coach Cal's teams, is just the experience factor if they get into a tight matchup early. But, I don't really see a ton of teams in this region that can give them trouble outside of Wofford. I think they match up well against Houston or Iowa State. So, and at bottom end of the draw, if Kentucky can get out of that round of 32 matchup, I think they'll be fine to making it to the Elite Eight, and I don't see anyone giving North Carolina trouble. So realistically, it comes down to that matchup between Carolina and Kentucky, and most people would take Carolina by and large, but Kentucky has more than enough skill to get past Carolina as well. So if you're looking for a differential to avoid looking too chalky with your picks, you can certainly put in Kentucky to get past Carolina if you want to differentiate yourself from the rest of your competition. So that does it for the Midwest region. I'll move on to the West region and give my thoughts there. But good luck, everyone, and we'll keep moving forward. So that's all for now.